Chapter 11. As the millennium came to an end. One of the consequences of this hardening of Chinese policy inside Tibet, quite apart from its terrible effects on ordinary Tibetan people, was the tragedy that took place over the selection of the new Panchen Lama. I had genuinely hoped that I could help with the search for the Panchen Lama's reincarnation by working with the Tashi Lumpo monastery in Tibet, and through it with the Chinese authorities. The recognition of the reincarnation of the Panchen Lama is, like in the case of important Tibetan lamas, a matter of great spiritual significance in Tibetan Buddhism, though the official selection of the Panchen Lama might have political significance from the perspective of Chinese authorities. In February 1991, on the third day of the Tibetan New Year, I conducted a divination on the question of whether the reincarnation had been born inside Tibet or outside, and the result indicated that he had been born within. So in March 1991, I conveyed a message to Beijing through the Chinese embassy in New Delhi, indicating that I would like to offer assistance in the process of the search for the new Panchen Lama. Ever since the fourth Panchen Lama, Lobsang Chokyi Gyaltsen's recognition of the fifth Dalai Lama in the 17th century, the Dalai Lamas and the Panchen Lamas have played key roles in recognizing each other's reincarnations. Given this historical tradition, Tibetans everywhere, as well as the communities of Tibetan Buddhists in the Himalayan regions that have a historical connection with the Panchen Lama institution, reached out to me asking that I recognize the new Panchen Lama. It was thus my responsibility, both historical and moral, to help in the search. On July 17th, 1993, Jadrel Rinpoche, the abbot of Tashi Lumpo in charge of the search process, met with my brother Gyalo Thondup in Beijing and handed him a scroll asking me to assist in the process. Naturally, I assumed that Jadrel Rinpoche was acting with full permission of the Chinese leadership, and consequently, I invited him to Dharamsala for consultation. Although he could not come, at the end of 1994, I received a carefully selected list of more than 20 candidates from Jadrel Rinpoche. He also conveyed to me that he and his search team considered one of these candidates, Gendun Chokyi Nyima, to be the true incarnation. On the basis of this information, I performed a series of divinations and other traditional procedures, such as consultations with oracles, and was pleased to come to the same conclusion. This information was passed confidentially to Jadrel Rinpoche in February 1995, with the text of a prayer for the long life of the young 11th Panchen Lama. I hoped he would be able to navigate the politics in Beijing, given that the reincarnation of a Lama is a religious matter in Tibetan Buddhism, and since the chosen candidate would be within the territory under Chinese control, my hope was that Jadrel Rinpoche and his team's choice would be acceptable to the Chinese leadership. I also wrote confidentially to Geshe Yeshe Wangchuk, a senior monk at Sera Monastery at the time in Tibet, informing him that I was really happy with how my own observations confirmed the candidate the search committee had recommended. Sending a copy of the long life prayer I had composed for the new Panchen Lama, I requested that Geshe use his influence to help assure the Chinese authorities that the parents of the new Panchen Lama had no contact with me whatsoever. I also informed him that, for the time being, I would keep the result of my observation confidential. Unfortunately, in March 1995, the Chinese government insisted that 3 to 5 names be placed in a golden urn for selection by lot, rather than approve the correct reincarnation. This put me in an impossible position. They were likely to choose a wrong candidate, So after a series of divinations, I came to the conclusion that I needed to share with the Tibetan Buddhists around the world the result of my own divinations on the reincarnation of the Panchen Lama. Thus, on May 14th, 1995, the full moon day of the 15th of the 4th month in the Tibetan calendar, having sent a day's advance notice to the Chinese government that was conveyed through my brother Gyalo Thondup, I formally announced that I had accepted Gendun Choekyi Nyima as the 11th Panchen Lama. I chose this day for this important announcement since it was an auspicious day connected with an important system of Buddhist teaching known as the Kalachakra Tantra, a set of teachings and practice with special association with the Panchen Lamas. I also made sure that a copy of my formal announcement was presented to the Chinese embassy in New Delhi, with also a request to have a copy forwarded to Jadrel Rinpoche and his search team at the Panchen Lama's Tashi Lunpo Monastery in Tibet. For me, this confirmation of the Panchen Lama's reincarnation was, first and foremost, a matter of integrity of Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Once I was convinced of the authenticity of the new Panchen Lama, the very person selected by the official search party set up by his own monastery, it was unthinkable that any other candidate could be endorsed. Unfortunately, the fallout was terrible. Jadrel Rinpoche was imprisoned for 6 years, and Tashi Lunpo Monastery was subjected to serious harassment, including the arrest of more than 30 monks. To this day, I have not heard any reliable news about Jadrel Rinpoche or his whereabouts, even though he is supposed to have been released from prison. Not only did he serve the previous Panchen Lama with dedication, but also he worked hard to ensure that the Panchen Lama's new reincarnation would be recognized in accordance with Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Furthermore, he tried his best to have the Beijing leadership approve the work of the search committee he was leading, and to that end, he kept Beijing abreast of all the stages in the search process. So to see him suffer so much for his sincere efforts was painful indeed. Gendun Choekyi Nyima, a boy of only 6 years old, and his family were detained, making the new Panchen Lama the youngest political prisoner in the world at the time. To this day, his whereabouts remain unknown, perhaps making this one of the best kept secrets in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. I have been told by some Chinese, one of them, in fact quite a knowledgeable person, that Gendun Choekyi Nyima has been living under a form of house arrest within the compound of a military base somewhere in mainland China. The Chinese authorities proceeded to select a different candidate, Gyaltsen Norbu, whose parents were both members of the Communist Party, and thrust him upon Tashi Lunpo Monastery as the new Panchen Lama. This act was accompanied by the stationing of a large number of Chinese soldiers in Shigatse, where the monastery is located. I feel deeply sad for the 2 boys caught up in this tragic situation. We know that the true Panchen Lama is missing, while the boy, chosen by the Chinese communist leadership and enthroned at Tashi Lunpo, is referred to by Tibetans as well as some Chinese Buddhists as the false Panchen Lama, or the Chinese Panchen Lama. To this day, the photo of Gendun Choekyi Nyima remains banned. In November 1996, the Chinese President Jiang Zemin came to India on an official visit for 8 days. I recognized it was not possible to meet him, but I took the opportunity of this visit to appeal to him, through a statement, to reverse China's repressive policy inside Tibet. On February 19, 1997, China's paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, died. In my statement on that day, I expressed my regret that serious negotiations on the issue of Tibet did not take place during Deng's lifetime, and also my hope that there were now new opportunities to reset the clock. In my letter of condolence to Jiang Zemin, I wrote, "It is very regrettable that serious negotiations on the issue of Tibet could not take place during Mr. Deng's lifetime. However, I firmly believe that the absence of Mr. Deng provides new opportunities and challenges for both Tibetans and the Chinese. I very much hope that under your leadership, the government of China will realize the wisdom of resolving the issue of Tibet through negotiations in a spirit of reconciliation and compromise. For my part, I remain committed to the belief that our problem can be solved only through negotiations, held in an atmosphere of sincerity and openness." Given Deng's initial overture with the statement to my brother that, except for independence, everything is negotiable, I had hoped that we could achieve some breakthrough during his leadership. Sadly, this was not to be. Deng's death marked the end of an era. He was the last of the old communist revolutionaries to rule China, and also the last of its senior leaders, whom I knew personally. He had been responsible for the opening up of China, and under his leadership, very significant headway was made in economic development, resulting in lifting millions of people out of poverty, especially the poverty caused by the famines of the Great Leap Forward and the suffering of the Cultural Revolution. At the same time, it was under Deng's watch that China's People's Liberation Army fired on its own people in Tiananmen Square. In March 1997, I had the good fortune to visit Taiwan for the first time. My official host was the Buddhist Association of China, Taiwan, and the government, ruled by the Nationalist Party, known also as Kuomintang, originally founded by Chiang Kai-shek, who, following Mao's communist takeover of mainland China in 1949, fled to this island. Given that Kuomintang, KMT, saw itself as a continuation of the government of the Republic of China, albeit away from the mainland, at the time it was still formally asserting sovereignty over all of mainland China, as well as Tibet. I was received officially by the Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui, which indicated that there was a softening of Taiwan's official position on the status of Tibet. Needless to say, my visit to Taiwan, including especially my meeting with the Taiwanese president, angered Beijing, which accused me of colluding with Taiwan to undermine China. For me personally, the most memorable and valuable aspect of the visit was the chance to meet with so many Chinese Buddhists who were sincere in their devotion to Buddhism and were free to practice their faith without interference from the state. In 2001, I visited Taiwan for the second time at the official invitation from President Chen Shui-bian. At that time, I also had the opportunity to meet with Tsai Ing-wen, who would later become the President of Taiwan. This was the beginning of Taiwan's relinquishing of their claim to sovereignty over Tibet, resulting in the issuing of visas to stateless Tibetans from India on their Indian travel documents and the eventual closing of the United Front Office, known formally as the Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission, originally established for dealing with the affairs of non-Chinese peoples like the Tibetans and the Mongols in Inner Mongolia. Finally, in 2009, in response to an invitation, I visited the southern part of Taiwan to pray at the sites of a massive typhoon that had caused much suffering and loss of life. As part of my usual approach of consulting the Tibetan people on an ongoing basis, an important gathering took place in September 1997, aimed at reviewing our position in relation to dialogue with the Chinese government. In the end, as I have often stated, it is the Tibetan people who must choose their destiny, not the Dalai Lama or the Communist Chinese government. At the conclusion of this meeting, the Assembly of Tibetan People's Deputies adopted a formal articulation of what I have described as the middle way approach. The key points were: without seeking independence for Tibet, the Central Tibetan Administration strives for the creation of a political entity comprising the 3 traditional provinces of Tibet. Such an entity should enjoy a status of genuine national regional autonomy. This autonomy should be governed by the popularly elected legislature and executive through a democratic process, and should have an independent judicial system. As soon as the above status is agreed upon by the Chinese government, Tibet would not seek separation from and remain within the People's Republic of China. The central government of the People's Republic of China has the responsibility for the political aspects of Tibet's international relations and defense, whereas the Tibetan people should manage all other affairs pertaining to Tibet, such as religion and culture, education, economy, health, ecological and environmental protection. To resolve the issue of Tibet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama shall take the main responsibility of sincerely pursuing negotiations and reconciliation with the Chinese government. On the Chinese side, one presumes in response, in February 1998, the State Council Information Office of the People's Republic of China issued a white paper entitled New Progress in Human Rights in the Tibet Autonomous Region, indicating an aggressive public strategy. The document concluded that the exiled Dalai Lama has tried by every means to cover it up and vilify and attack the development of progress in New Tibet. It went on to say, the Dalai Lama's wanton fabrication of lies and his violation and trampling of this commandment serve only to expose him in all his true colors. He is waving the banner of religion to conduct activities aimed at splitting the motherland. In the meantime, on my part, I strove to encourage China's entry into the mainstream of the world community. My deep belief was then, as it is now, that the opening up of China was in the best interests of the Chinese people. So, when discussions and debates were taking place as to whether or not the United States should grant most favored nation trading status to China, I expressed my support for doing so. In fact, I wrote to the chair of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee expressing my personal encouragement for granting this status. As far as our direct contact with the Beijing leadership was concerned, after 1989, nothing of substance happened for many years. That said, there were indeed a few meetings in Hong Kong and Chiang Mai, Thailand, confidential at the time, between my envoys Lodi Gyari and Kelsang Gyaltsen and an emissary from the Chinese President Jiang Zemin. Also, on September 28, 1997, when Senator Dianne Feinstein and her husband, the American businessman Richard Blum, met with the Chinese president, they were kind enough to deliver by hand a letter from me to Jiang Zemin. This was several months before the summit in Beijing between President Bill Clinton and Jiang. At the press conference in Beijing, Clinton revealed that the question of Tibet had been discussed, and he urged the resumption of dialogue. Jiang commented, "Actually, as long as the Dalai Lama can publicly make a statement and a commitment that Tibet is an inalienable part of China and that he must also recognize Taiwan as a province of China, then the door to dialogue and negotiation is open. Actually, we are having several channels of communications with the Dalai Lama, so I hope the Dalai Lama will make positive response in this regard." This was the first time that the head of the People's Republic of China had publicly addressed the question of Tibet and spoken of the possibility for a genuine dialogue. Of course, as to Jiang's first condition, he knew that I had already made public statements relinquishing the call for independence ever since my speech to the European Parliament in Strasbourg in 1988. With respect to the second condition, frankly, the question of Taiwan is totally unconnected to Tibet and our cause. Jiang may have been sincere in reaching out to my envoy, but it was unclear to what extent he had support within the Chinese Politburo. As the eventful decade of the 1990s drew to an end, there was one pleasant surprise. The 14-year-old Karmapa, head of the Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, escaped into India from Tibet, arriving suddenly in Dharamsala on January 5th, 2000. I knew his predecessor, the 16th Karmapa, who had been an important Lama among senior Tibetan spiritual leaders that came into exile in 1959. So I was very happy to welcome the new Karmapa, Ogyen Trinley Dorje, and offered to assist him and his entourage in whatever ways I could, especially in relation to his education.